Thank you all again for coming to the IEF's grant writing workshop. We hope this experience will be helpful to you as you prepare a proposal either for IEF's own grant program or for other conservation grants. My name is Chase Ledoux. I am IEF's Special Projects Manager, and here with me today I have Sarah Conley. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi guys, I'm Sarah Conley. I've met many of you. I'm the Assistant Director of Conservation, and we are so happy to bring this workshop to you as a resource, both for our IEF's RFP and for other funding opportunities that you may encounter.
Great, thanks so much. And also with us today is Debbie Olson, IEF's Executive Director. Um, so the three of us are here to try and help you improve your grant writing skills. And if you have any questions, we'll save those towards the end. Just some logistics about the workshop today. It is being recorded for later view, and then we plan to send out a PDF of the slides that we'll go through today. To save on bandwidth, please turn off your cameras just so that we can make sure the workshop is communicated to everyone as efficiently as possible, and keep yourselves muted unless we have time to ask and answer questions at the end. If at any point you do have questions, feel free to put those in the chat. Sarah will be monitoring those. If she can answer them really quickly, I'm sure she'll provide an answer in the chat. Otherwise, we'll get to them at the end. If there are so many questions at the end that we don't have time to get to, we'll send out the answer to those questions to all the attendees at the workshop. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Let's go through the answers to the poll. It looks like a lot of you are the primary person responsible for writing grant proposals for your organization. Um, and a lot of you have good experience writing grants. I understand the environment for writing conservation grants right now is challenging in the global environment we're in. But hopefully this experience will help focus your proposals to be more effective to a wide variety of funders. I've certainly been in your position trying to seek funding for conservation projects I think are really important, but it wasn't until I learned about the mechanics of actually writing a proposal and what funders are looking for that I started having some success. So the goal of our workshop today, and we can't accomplish everything in a 60-minute time window, but we'll do as much as we can. Our goal is to equip you with knowledge and practical skills needed to develop compelling and competitive grant proposals for elephant conservation. Thank you all for being here. It's an important first step. As part of the registration process, we asked you all what the most challenging part about writing grant proposals was, and we got a lot of interesting feedback. But a lot of the questions fell into one of these four categories about preparing a grant proposal. The first is conceptualizing your project. The second is setting goals and objectives. The third is monitoring and evaluating outcomes. And the fourth is planning a budget. So we're going to go through these four major topics today in succession. Um, Before we start, I'd like to thank a lot of people who have helped contribute to this workshop today. Many of you may be familiar with International Rhino Foundation's grant writing program. We consulted with them a lot in developing the tools we're going to share with you today. So thanks to IRF for doing that. And a number of other individuals also provided their advice. A lot of these people work for other funding agencies that also receive a lot of requests for elephant conservation proposals. Before you actually start writing a grant, though, it's important to identify appropriate funding sources, and this is really key. Be sure to carefully read through an organization's website. The call for proposals should outline exactly what sort of projects they're willing to fund. And if the information is available, go back and look at what projects they've funded in the past to see if your project falls in line with something similar. It's also worth reaching out to the funding agency personally if that's an option for you, just to run an idea by them, because of course it'd be frustrating to work so hard on proposal and submit it to an organization that really doesn't have the scope to fund a project like yours. Um, all of IEF's projects that we've funded in the past several years are available on our website, so you're free to peruse them and understand the sort of work that IEF prefers to fund. But we hope that the lessons you learn here will be applicable for funding beyond the International Elephant Foundation, for other organizations that fund elephant conservation work and even other biodiversity work. So the first step is making sure you have a solid, well-designed project strategy. I think a lot of times we forget that as we're writing proposals, uh, we're just submitting it to this black box organization, but it's important to remember that people fund people. So it's important to know your audience. Each donor or funding body is unique and has a preference about what they like to fund, as I was talking about just a few minutes ago. It's also important to realize that you shouldn't assume the reader knows exactly what you're talking about. Set some context in order to tell your story. The story really needs to come through from your writing in your grant proposal. Of course, if you're submitting a proposal to a place like International Elephant Foundation, you don't have to go into explaining what the three species of elephants are or where elephants are found in the world, but we may not be experts about your specific location. So give us the context and an easy to understand summary so that we can catch up to speed to where you are in your conservation process. It's also important to not overload the reader with more detail or information than is needed. As you can imagine, places like IEF get a lot of different funding requests, and we have to go through all those requests very carefully to do our due diligence. Um, we want to completely understand your project, but if there's information that may be fluff or may not be pertinent to your specific project goals, that's probably not appropriate to include in the proposal. Um, we at IEF, and I'm sure most other funding bodies, have certain limits, like word limits or character limits, about what you can include in your proposal. And you don't have to go all the way to the maximum of those limits. Those are just sort of guide rails to make sure you're being focused. But we would certainly prefer to fund a shorter, focused proposal that is very strong than one that fills all of the word limits but has a lot of information that is not pertinent to the project. So one of the first sections in any grant proposal is the project background and introduction. Make sure you're using descriptive language to transport the reader. This is all part of setting the stage and starting to tell the story of your project. Provide an overview of your project. What is the essential background information that the donor needs to know? This harkens back to know your donor, know your funder. You don't have to provide a taxonomy lesson about elephants to the International Elephant Foundation. We get it. But you may have to provide some information about the specifics of your situation wherever your conservation project is located. It's good to think of this section as sort of a funnel or an inverted pyramid, where you want to start off this section very broad, talking about broad problems, and then move down to the specifics so that we understand the particulars of the case in your location. When possible, and when the mechanics of the proposal allow, it's good to use thoughtful photos and maps to help paint a picture and add visual appeal. IEF's call for proposals requires you to submit a map and photos of elephants at your site, all to help us assess what the area where you're working is like. Throughout this workshop, we're going to go through some examples that very closely mimic proposals we've actually received before, so you can understand what to do and maybe what to avoid. So here's a good example of what we often receive in terms of project backgrounds. And as I read this, evaluate in your mind, based on what I just told you, whether or not this would be a good project background. So, Minaria National Park covers almost 9,000 hectares in Sri Lanka. In its boundaries, Minaria possesses 75 butterflies, 9 amphibians, 160 birds, 25 reptiles, and 24 mammals. The main habitats of Minaria include low canopy montane forests, high canopy secondary forests, scrublands, chain-o-lands, grasslands, rocky outcrops, and wetlands. The park was declared protected first in 1938 to protect the catchment of the Minaria tank and the wildlife of the surrounding area. Along with Caudala and Girtale, Minaria forms one of the 70 important bird areas of Sri Lanka. Minaria is thought to host one of the largest annual gatherings of elephants in Asia. So, with my tone and my fast language, I hope you've interpreted that this is a lot of maybe information that does not help IEF in particular evaluate whether this is an area needed of conservation intervention. So there's a lot of unnecessary information in here about how many different species of wildlife there are. And unless you've been to Minaria National Park, it's really hard to picture in your mind what this place looks like. Instead, writing something like this, maybe accompanied with a picture, will help provide the donor or funder with a good mental image of what this area looks like. And this is all part of telling your story. So instead, you can write something like Manaria National Park, encompassing nearly 9,000 hectares in Sri Lanka's dry zone, stands as a key protected area. The park's diverse habitats, ranging from montane forest to grasslands to wetlands, support a significant number of species, several which are endemic to Sri Lanka. Furthermore, Manaria, along with two adjacent protected areas, forms part of one of Sri Lanka's 70 important bird areas. Notably, the park is renowned for hosting one of the largest annual gatherings of elephants in Asia, a phenomenon of significant conservation concern and opportunity. So, not only is this paragraph a little bit shorter than the poor example we just shared, it also uses more descriptive language and it doesn't overwhelm the reader with too many statistics, which is good. Another part of conceptualizing your project is demonstrating the project need or opportunity for funding that will make an impact for elephant conservation. So, as you're writing this section, you should take a step back and really to yourself defend what the fundamental justification for your project is. Why is funding needed now? And why can't funding wait? And why is your project specifically deserving of funding compared to all of the other needs for elephant conservation that there are out there? As you're describing this need, you should broadly describe why this project is so important for the species or area in which you're working. As I said before, move from the broad needs to the specific threats, questions, or problem. You can talk about things like how widespread is the problem? What are the underlying driving forces? How is it impacting the species or ecosystem? And how is it impacting local communities and other stakeholders? As I said before, it's great to convey urgency, but do not exaggerate. We may not be familiar with your particular area, but we do have some context about elephant conservation, especially here at IEF, but other funders do too. So we can sort of see through proposals that may over exaggerate the conservation situation or the need for intervention at this exact moment. It's particularly effective if you instead ensure that your project builds upon existing strong base of evidence. So to help demonstrate what we just talked about, as we mentioned earlier, International Elephant Foundation, our RFP or our request for proposals is due in just a few months on August 1st. So throughout the workshop, I'm going to make these sidebars to talk about where the information we just talked about fits into IEF's proposal. So here are 4 questions that sort of get to the meat of conceptualizing your project. We give you a section for providing the background and context that justifies the need for your project. We ask you to describe what you believe is most important about the project and how your work will benefit the specific elephants, habitat, other wildlife, and human communities. We ask you to explain if your approach is new. If it is new, we want you to defend why you think it will be successful. If it's not new, which is totally fine, we just want you to relate your approach that you're proposing to similar projects that have used similar methods so that we can get an understanding of whether there's a proven track record for what you're trying to do. And
Sorry, Chase. Let me
uh-huh.
interject on that. It's very important that we see that you're not reinventing the wheel. So if there has been a similar project, you should be able to justify why that project or why your version of that project is important to do now, or you acknowledge that you know that project existed and it is the proven track record upon which you're building yours. Whatever it is, make sure that the grant organization, whatever it is, whether it's IEF or another one, knows that you know the context in the work that you're doing. So you're not reinventing the wheel and that you are building upon proven work, or if you're doing something novel. But it's important to make sure that you have um, that basis for everyone to truly evaluate your work and have more confidence in your approach.
That's a really good point, Sarah. Thanks for interjecting. Yes, not reinventing the wheel is important, and we'll talk more about that later on in the workshop too. We also want you to sort of set the picture for how your proposal fits into future elephant conservation plans. International Elephant Foundation strongly prefers to fund projects that we see as sustainable that have strong community buy-in. So while we tend to fund um, projects at the beginning that are shorter in duration from 1 to just a few years, obviously elephant conservation takes time. And so we want to see that the funding for this project that may be of relatively limited scope fits into a broader, longer picture of elephant conservation in your region. Okay, so you've set the stage, you've defended the need for your project, you've started telling your story, and the reader can sort of picture what the situation looks like at your site. You're off to a good start. But the really important crux of your proposal lies in setting goals and objectives. And at IEF, we've noticed in particular that this is an area of the proposal that a lot of people have challenges with, just because it can be difficult to distinguish these terms from each other if you're not familiar with writing grant proposals in the past. The goals and objectives are the backbone of your project. They really are the structure that everything else builds off of. Sometimes it may be good to even start with this section so you can understand the context that you need to provide or explain so that the reader or evaluator understands where your goals are coming from. These three terms on the slide, goals, objectives, and activities, are not interchangeable. I know when you read them on a page, you may draw comparisons, and so you may think that the language is sort of fluid, but we mean very specific things when we talk about a goal versus an objective. And I'll explain how those two are distinguished in just a minute. But you should see this just as in the introduction to your proposal going from broad to specific. As you're introducing your goals and objectives, you should also start broad with broad goals. Objectives are more specific that build off of the goals, and then activities go with each objective and are even more specific that explain what you need to do. So let's start with goals. Goals are major target accomplishments. Generally, goal statements should be really short and strong and communicate what you plan to achieve in one sentence. And so, oftentimes, when I'm writing goal statements, I like to challenge myself to make this goal statement as short as possible because those goals should be really impactful and to the reader. And oftentimes, things are more impactful if they're shorter and easier to digest. I'm not saying they shouldn't be specific, but they should most often they're broader than what you might expect. These goals should be just a logical extension of the introduction. It should be really easy to read the introduction and just flow right into the goal statement. And they should relate to the interests of your audience. That is, the interests of the grant agency or funding body, or IEF in this case. In your goal statement, we don't care about how you're going to accomplish that goal. We're going to ask about that later. So you shouldn't be talking about how that goal is going to be accomplished as you're writing your statement. So to dive into another example of a goal statement, this is very similar to what IEF often receives. The goal of this project is to implement anti-poaching patrols, conduct community education programs, and restore key elephant habitats in order to achieve a long-term increase in the elephant population of Safari National Park through collaborative conservation efforts. I hope you understand that this is a very long goal statement. Some might call it rambling. And instead of talking about the target, the accomplishment we're aiming for, it just talks about how that accomplishment is going to be achieved. And it's not a single focused target statement. So it would be very easy to think this would be what a place like IEF is looking for. But when we ask for a goal, we're looking for something much more succinct. Instead, what we're looking for is the goal of this project is to stabilize the population of elephants in Safari National Park. All of those things about safari patrols or community engagement, we're interested in those when we talk about objectives and activities, but right now we're just interested in what do you actually want to achieve in your project. IEF allows for you to have multiple goal statements because it's possible you may be able to achieve multiple goals within the scope of your project, but these should really be big picture, and it's completely justifiable in a lot of cases that you really only have one goal that you're aiming for. Okay, so let's move from goals to objectives now. When we're talking about objectives, here are the questions you should be asking yourself. What are the measurable objectives or targets you will accomplish within the project to meet the goal, the big goal statement you have in mind? What impact are you trying to have? What are the key changes or conditions that you will achieve? And I think a lot of people move from goal statement to objectives immediately thinking like, how am I going to achieve that goal? And we're not just there yet, so don't jump the gun. Objectives are not how you're going to do it. That is what we're going to talk about in activities. We're looking for objective statements that are necessary and sufficient to achieve the goal. So it's probably easiest to conceptualize these topics by going back to our example. So for our example is wanting to stabilize the population of elephants in this hypothetical park called Safari National Park. It might be tempting to write these objective statements. Conduct 10 anti-poaching patrols per month across the park, hold 4 community meetings in villages surrounding the park each year, and write and disseminate a proposal to potential ecotourism investors. All of these activities, and notice I use the term activities, would be really helpful in helping to stabilize elephant population. But these statements all focus on activities, not the impact you're trying to make to achieve that goal. Here's another set of examples. The 3 objectives of this project are to survey the local bird population within the park, train park rangers in first aid techniques, and upgrade the park's visitor center. If we have in mind our goal statement is to stabilize the elephant population in Safari National Park, these objective statements are not good because they're not necessary and sufficient to achieve the goal. Remember, your funders are coming into your proposal more or less blind about your situation. And so if you say you want to do one thing in your goal statement, but then your objective statements are written in a way that doesn't clearly connect the goals to the objectives, we're going to see a disconnect and we're not going to understand where that logical jump you made was. So these are also bad examples of objective statements as they relate to the example goal statement of stabilizing the elephant population. Let's go through another example. The 3 objectives of this project, again, if the goal is to stabilize elephant populations, is to ensure elephants in Safari National Park are protected, work towards a healthy elephant population, and support the long-term survival of the elephants in the region. These also sound really good, but as they relate to the goal statement, these are just restatements. These are just all 3 different ways to sort of say we want to stabilize the elephant population. So while it's good to keep that lofty mindset as you're writing these, it's also important you really dive into the meat of the issue and talk about objectives that are sufficient to meet the goal and aren't just restatements of the goal. So finally, here are some good examples of objective statements as they relate to that hypothetical goal statement of stabilizing the elephant population. The 3 objectives are to increase local engagement in anti-poaching efforts, to develop political consensus for ecotourism, and to secure the financial investment needed to develop an ecotourism site. These are great objective statements because they explain sort of the 3 main areas that you're going to work towards to achieve the goal. They're necessary and sufficient to achieve the goal, and they're not just simple restatements of the goal. You really start to understand how this will happen. Notice, though, that we don't provide too many details in these objective statements about what you're actually doing. There are many different ways you might increase local engagement in anti-poaching. We'll go into that in our activities when we describe that in the proposal, but we're not going to go into that into the objectives just yet. Okay, and then as we flow from goals to objectives to activities, activities is often where people jump straight to in their mind, but really you should be saving that for the end. These are the specific actions you're going to take, how you'll get to the problem of the goal statement all the way to the solution. It's important here to know the scope of whatever fund you're applying to. IEF prefers to fund projects whose objectives and goals can be achieved within a relatively short amount of time, 1 to 2 years, maybe just a little bit longer than that. But you really want your activities to be focused enough that they are achievable within whatever time frame the grant sets out for you. Be specific. It's good to ask those classic questions of who, what, where, when, and how, because those are the questions the funder is going to have as they're evaluating your proposal. So you should be able to spell those out in your activities. It's often good to be clear about what organization and staff are implementing each activity. Conservation is a very collaborative process, and so a lot of different people or stakeholders can be involved. And designating which person or organization is going to be spearheading each activity can help the funder be at ease to know who's going to be responsible for each activity. And just as your objectives should cover the basis of your goal statement, your activities should be necessary and sufficient to accomplish your objectives. So again, it's probably helpful to explain these with an example. So if my objective is to increase local community engagement in anti-poaching efforts, activities about that these activity statements: conducting community meetings, talking to people about poaching, training community members, developing a program to involve local communities, these are all not very specific. We don't know the who, the what, the where, the when, and the how. Um, these are really too broad. I know we talked about making the goals and objectives broad, but when we talk about activities, we want to be sort of as specific as possible. So, for example, we could revise these activity statements to be much better by using these instead. The first activity, community outreach officer will hold 3 participatory workshops per month in 5 key communities bordering the park using visuals and storytelling to discuss anti-poaching and gather local input. Let's look at that first one alone. Notice we have the who question answered. It's going to be the community outreach officer. We have the what, the 3 participatory workshops. We have the when, 3 workshops per month. And we have the how. They're going to use visuals and storytelling to discuss anti-poaching. So this is a great activity statement because it directly relates to the objective, and it also explains those basic questions that an evaluator might have. Here are 2 other good activity statements that relate to that objective. Head of security will train 10 community members to form community ranger units with equipment to conduct regular patrols in buffer zones of park. Notice it answered those 4 or 5 basic questions again about who, what, when, where, and how. The third activity statement, community outreach officer to hold monthly follow-up meetings in the villages for ranger reports, challenge discussions, park staff mentorship, and community education. Again, a really good activity statement that answers those questions. So I hope now you have a better idea about how to distinguish goals from objectives to activities. Remember, your goals are really broad. It's oftentimes you only have one or a few of these per proposal, so don't get too specific about the goal statements. Your objectives are the necessary and sufficient actions to achieve that goal, and the activities explain the who, what, when, where, and how of how those objectives will be achieved, all in support of that goal. So, another challenging part of writing grant proposals is talking about how you're going to monitor and evaluate the outcomes of your project. This is another area of proposals that we've seen a lot of people find challenges with just because um, you sort of have to read between the lines of what we're actually asking you to evaluate. One of the most common misconceptions we have in this section is a lot of applicants will write about outputs and not outcomes. So outputs are pretty easy to write about. These are like the expected products that will result from your project. Things like management plans or brochures that you distribute or posters that you put up in the community or training manuals. Oftentimes it's easy to just say we'll host these meetings or workshops where we'll train 50 people and we'll do one of those a month. So at the end of the project, we'll have 500 people who have been exposed to our message. Or it's really easy to summarize how many patrols your anti-poaching patrols will conduct. Those are all outputs. It's great to know, but it doesn't actually explain the tangible impact your project has had in the area. Instead of outputs, what we're actually looking for is outcomes. These are the measurable consequences of your activities that indicate whether your project is actually making a real difference and can be more challenging to actually measure. So if we go back to the output of the number of people trained, it's really great that you reach a large amount of people, but what we really want to know is that you're measuring the impact of training those people. So oftentimes applicants just need to move a step further when they talk about what sort of outcomes they're wanting to measure. These are things like the increase in the species population or tolerance for wildlife in the community where you work. Things like decrease in the prevalence of human-elephant conflict or illegal activities. These are the actual impacts on conservation we want to make sure our funding is going towards supporting, not necessarily the number of posters you've distributed or the number of workshops you've held, because while those are activities that are necessary to get to those outcomes, they don't actually measure the impact on conservation. So again, we'll go through some examples. We've received these as written outcomes in all of the proposals we evaluate, and I sort of talked about them on the previous slide. Things like conducting anti-poaching patrols, holding community meetings, increasing awareness, implementing an ecotourism site, or securing more funding for conservation. All of these are not actually outcomes, even though you may label them like that on the slide. These are all outputs or activities. A lot of these are not actually measurable, so things like an increased awareness of elephant conservation, unless you describe some survey or poll or other measurable device that you're using to measure awareness, um, we can't actually measure the impact that the funding has on that in terms of conservation. Other things are not necessarily a direct impact on the goal, like securing more funding for conservation. We all need more funding for conservation, and it's great to have more funding for conservation. But if your goal is to stabilize elephant population, for example, securing more funding does not directly explain how much of an impact our funding is having on stabilizing that elephant population. Instead, these are really well-written outcome statements. Things like a 20% reduction in reported elephant poaching incidents over a 3-year period. These are very time limited, they're relevant to the goal, they seem achievable within the project period, and they're measurable. You can actually measure population change over time, for example. Here's another one, increase of 30% of positive attitudes towards elephant conservation among residents in target communities measured by pre and post surveys of knowledge, attitude, and practice. So again, this goes back to the previous slide when our output was increased awareness for elephant conservation. Now we've provided an actual way to measure that through these pre and post surveys. A lot of people want to host workshops in communities, which is great, but unless you're evaluating the impact of holding those workshops, it's very difficult for us at IEF to evaluate whether our funding is actually making a tangible impact. And here are two more examples of outcomes that are good because they're specific and measurable. Increase of 15% of secured elephant habitat within the park due to successful restoration of corridors, or a sustained annual increase of 5% in reported tourist revenue allocated to elephant conservation initiatives by partner lodges over 2 years. Again, this one is particularly effective because it's time bound. Again, most funding agencies want you to have a very specific timeline for your project to achieve those goals and objectives. So making your outcomes very specific to that time frame is very helpful as we're evaluating those. So let's go back to IEF's RFP, and this is where we ask about monitoring and evaluating outcomes. First, we ask you what will you measure to determine the effectiveness of your project activities and methods in addressing those needs. How will you actually measure it? So we ask very specifically how you're going to measure it during the operation of the project and at the end of the project. We ask you to identify if and how project participants and beneficiaries will participate in monitoring and evaluation activities. It's often good to talk about who's going to be responsible for these things. We ask you to describe how findings will contribute to decision-making and project activities during and after the project period. So so you're actually adjusting your approach to conservation, or you're using the data you generate to actually guide your actions is very helpful. And then when we ask you to identify how you will determine the degree of success of the project, it's very helpful to write statements like those outcome statements I showed you examples of on the previous slide, so that we can actually evaluate if the funding is having the impact that you set out to have. Okay, and the last section we'll talk about today in the proposal is planning a budget. A lot of you indicated that planning a budget was one of the most challenging parts of writing a grant proposal, and it it certainly can be challenging, especially because oftentimes different funding agencies have different requirements about what they will fund, what they won't fund, how to structure your budget, those sorts of things. So these terms are applicable to pretty much any grant application. Is distinguishing between direct and indirect costs. So direct costs are those that are directly attributable to project activities. These are things that you need to pay for to achieve the project that you've described in this time-limited project proposal. Things like salaries for project staff, equipment, travel expenses for data collection, workshop costs, community outreach materials, anti-poaching patrol expenses, habitat restoration supplies, or research supplies. Indirect costs, often called overhead, are those that are incurred by your organization in the course of normal business or normal work, but they're not easily linked to the specific projects. So things like administrative salaries, rent for your organization's workspace, utilities, insurance, accounting, general office supplies. These things are not easy to tie to that 1 or 2 year project you're describing in your proposal. So it's very, very important as you're considering what to direct your proposal to, what to design your budget for, to understand whether your funder will fund either direct costs or indirect costs or both. I say that because for IEF, we do not fund overhead, so we will not fund indirect costs. We prefer to fund action items that are very specific to that limited time frame in the proposal you're describing. So be very careful as you're following those guidelines that are written in the RFP for whatever funder you're applying towards. Because, of course, it'd be a shame to craft this beautifully written proposal with great defense for why the project is needed and beautifully written goals and objectives. And then if you design a budget that has a lot of overhead and you submit it to IEF, we cannot fund those. So it's really important to know what is allowable in terms of indirect costs. For IEF, it's no indirect costs are allowed. In terms of planning a budget, this is applicable to any grant you're applying for. Make sure to clearly justify every cost by providing a brief explanation of why the item is necessary for the project's success. Just as with any other section in your proposal, everything should directly relate to each other. So you should have already introduced the activities. And so when you're introducing the budget, it's very easy to understand why you need those supplies or why you need to pay for those patrols or something like that. It's very helpful to match each cost directly to the specific activities that you've already described, and make sure you're being realistic and reasonable to ensure that budget is both adequate and cost effective. As we all know, funding for conservation is not as big as we would all like it to be, and so every dollar counts. And so make sure you're providing realistic estimates and budgets for everything you describe in your proposal. It's also very helpful as we're evaluating proposals if the applicant has explained very clearly how the requested funds will be used efficiently to maximize the impact, to have a really strong return on investment. We all know that basic supplies and equipment are often needed to carry them out, but we want to make sure as we're investing in those supplies or equipment or rangers or anything like that, that we're spending that money wisely to maximize the impact to get the biggest bang for our buck, essentially. So if you look at the budget guidelines that IEF has in its request for a proposal, we seek a very detailed budget with detailed individual item costs. So for example, if you've got if you want to fund 10 rangers to conduct nightly patrols, all of those rangers probably need a flashlight or a torch to see during the night. We don't want you to budget just $100 for flashlights. We want you to explain where that $100 came from because we don't assume that it's just one flashlight that costs $100. You should explain that you wanted a flashlight, you want it multiplied by 10 units because you've got 10 rangers, for instance, and each flashlight costs $10 per unit, and so you're requesting $100 total. That's the sort of detail we're looking for. And we want actual figures, not just batches that are non-specific. So if you're doing a research project in the lab, we don't want you to just write lab supplies, $100. We want you to detail exactly what supplies you're asking for. Again, IEF prefers to fund action items, so we want things that are directly actionable that support the goals and objectives you've described in your proposal. I can't emphasize enough, we do not fund overhead or indirect costs or contingency costs. We also do not fund armaments or ammunition for rangers. We don't pay for paid informants. We don't pay for tuition fees for advanced degrees. So if in the course of your project, a graduate student will get their degree, that's great, but we don't fund the tuition for those graduate students. And we also do not fund out-of-country travel to a project site. So if your organization is located outside of the country where you're having an impact, IEF does not fund the flights to get to that country. We've also, in our request for proposals at IEF, provided a table where you fill in the exact numbers, sort of outlining the equation that I talked about on the last thing. You just want to make sure that as you're filling out this table, that it reflects your proposed activities. Oftentimes we read proposals that are beautifully written, but then we don't understand why they're asking for a certain budget item because you're talking about flashlights, for instance, but nowhere in the proposal have you talked about patrols that are needed. This table is very helpful as you're making sure all your costs match up, so make sure you're filling this out carefully. We also have a section after this table where you justify each budget item. So you should go through line by line to carefully explain um, what each item is and why it's needed and how that helps you achieve your goal. Sarah, did you have something to add?
Thanks, Chase. Yeah, I was just going to add a note about the international travel that you mentioned on the last slide. Um, that dovetails with one of the things that you said early on about how IEF likes to see a large amount of sustainability with the project. So if your project has a big portion of the budget that is international travel, that's an indicator to us that you don't have the people on the ground where the project is located to carry out this project. So it's a question of sustainability, it's a question of local buy-in. We like to see that there's community involvement, that there's community engagement with your work. So if we are just being asked to fund something where it's folks living in a country not connected to this work at all, and they're just parachuting in and then parachuting out, that is not going to be a likely project that we will fund. So keep that in mind. It's all thematically connected. We want to be able to have sustainability. We want community connection, and your budget even will show indicators to that. So if you write everything in a way where it makes sense together, that's going to have a much bigger impact to the reviewer.
Very good point, Sarah. Okay, the last section of this presentation before we get into questions is just some grant writing do's and don'ts because there are all these weird little things about writing grants that sort of tips that we've collected over the hundreds of proposals we've reviewed. It's very helpful to write in a way that is easily understood and relatable. We've obviously received a lot of proposals from a lot of different places, but it's good to make sure your evaluator completely understands what you're talking about. So don't write something like we aim to define and protect key biodiversity areas because your evaluator might not know what a key biodiversity area is in your context. So instead, you can write something like We seek to protect areas that provide habitat for threatened and vulnerable species. You don't have to use the terminology, you don't have to use some acronym, you've just explained exactly what you're seeking to do. You want to make sure to use active voice instead of passive voice. This is again just a writing style that makes it clearer to the reader. So don't say training sessions will be held to inform potential grant recipients. Instead, say something like, we will hold training sessions to inform potential grant recipients, because it says, who is doing this? We are. Or if someone else is doing it, say they are. But just by saying training sessions will be held, we don't sort of know who is doing that. When you can be brief. I talked about this earlier on in the workshop, but it's if you can say something in 20 words instead of 50 words and still be just as clear, say it in 20 words. So a bad example of this is at this point in time, our program in Safari National Park is making ready to extract itself from the unproductive and failed partnership with our partner. A lot of unnecessary words there when you could just say our Safari National Park program is preparing to end its unproductive partnership. You want to understand exactly the same information from that shorter statement than you did in the longer statement. Again, don't be tempted by the maximum word limit to think you have to fill up that word limit. If you can say it briefer, that's always better, while still conveying the same message, of course. Other random grant writing tips: avoid excessive use of acronyms. A few of them in a proposal is probably fine, or using acronyms that are fairly common in our field, like HEC for human elephant conflict. Those are probably fine. But if you've got a list of 10 or 15 different acronyms that you're using a lot throughout the proposal, it can be very difficult for an evaluator to understand what's going on as they're having to learn all of these acronyms on the fly. As Sarah emphasized at the beginning, don't reinvent the wheel, recycle. There are different levels of this that are applicable. So, as Sarah was talking about earlier, it's fairly rare that we fund a completely novel approach to elephant conservation. We often prefer to fund things that have a proven track record. So, don't feel like you have to come up with something new in your area to test if something else has already been tested to be effective. The other thing, don't reinvent the wheel as you're writing grant proposals. So oftentimes different funding bodies will request similar information. You can use that information to adapt to new grant proposals, like if you're writing one for IEF and then you want to apply for funding from some other body, it's completely fine to use a lot of the same text. However, what's important is that you're adapting that text to the specific requirements of your RFP. So make sure that you don't just fall into the trap of just copy pasting big blocks of text. Make sure you're exactly answering the questions that are provided in the RFP. IEF, for instance, we over the years have learned exactly the sort of information we're looking for. So the wording we use in our questions, we agonize over that for many weeks. We change it year to year as we learn new things and realize we are actually requesting something else. So make sure the language you're using directly addresses the question being asked of you in your RFP. Sarah, what else did you have to add to that?
Just a note on recycling. Recycle wording, massage it, reuse it. You should have a new budget for every proposal. You should not be asking IEF for the same $100 for flashlights that you ask another organization, because if you both get funded, now who do you go back to and ask for a change? So be strategic in how you apply for, especially if you're applying for multiple grants for the same project. Um, so don't just copy and paste the same budget to every proposal. You'll have to think about what best fits that RFP and what they want to fund.
Good point, Sarah. We understand conservation is expensive, and so it's unlikely in a lot of cases that you'll get all the funding you need for a project completely from one source. So just be mindful about what you're asking from each source to make sure there's no overlap. Another tip is as you're writing a proposal, make sure you're using quote unquote real verbs and nouns. So a lot of times we like to use business lingo or things that or idioms or phrases that don't have actual meaning. And this goes to make sure you're not being too wordy in your writing. Make sure it's very focused. So, for example, the top sentence is one that uses verbs that don't have real meaning, things like sharpen identification of. That really just means identify. So just use the word identify because it's shorter and it means its meaning is more obvious. Things like using the phrase target actions, you could say more succinctly by just saying act. Those sorts of things over time really compound on itself. So you may sprinkle those terms in throughout your proposal, but if it's just sentence after sentence of all of this flowery, verbose language, it's really hard to understand what you're actually going to do. Some final things to emphasize. Make sure, especially in your activity statements, that you're answering the questions who, what, where, when, and how. Make sure you're proofreading a lot. Our proposals are written in English, and I understand a lot of you, English is not your first language, which is fine. We like to fund, as we've emphasized, community-driven projects where English probably isn't the first language. And so we can understand if your English writing is not perfectly understandable. Um, but there are now more than ever free proofreading services available that can help you understand, or colleagues that may be more proficient in English that can help make sure the writing is appropriate enough to be understood. However, things like spacing or punctuation or style or formatting, things that transcend the English language, are also really important. You want to make sure the few minutes your evaluator has with your proposal are really effective and you're communicating exactly what you want to get across. If the evaluator has to jump through hoops because you've got weird formatting or style or punctuation that's out of place, it can be really hard to understand what you're actually saying. So make sure these things count. Don't be afraid to brag. A lot of you are doing amazing work for elephant conservation, and so you should be proud of that. And it oftentimes your success is justification, strong justification for funding you. And so we want to build upon that success, but also be realistic. Conservation is a collaborative, community-driven process, and no one person is going to solve elephant conservation. So just make sure you're realistic in what you can achieve and how you're collaborating to achieve those goals and objectives. Another thing is at the beginning at IEF's proposal and at the beginning of a lot of proposals, we ask for a summary of a lot of these different sections. That should be saved for last. I know because it comes first in the proposal, it might be really tempting to just fill that out while you're there. But really, if you haven't thought through your proposal and the subsequent sections, like your goal statements and your activities, it can be good to just throw something at the wall and see what sticks at the beginning of your proposal when it probably deserves a little bit more thought. So save the beginning section to write for the end as you've finished and edited all of your other proposal, and you'll be much more effective. The reason we put this section first in the proposal is so that our evaluators can really get to understand your project and the overview of your project before diving deep into the details, and that's why it comes first. So this is just another plug for IEF's request for proposals. The 2026 grant application is due the 1st of August at 11:59 Pacific time. It is just like last year, an online form that you fill out. It's available on our website at elephantconservation.org. I know online forms can be tricky and finicky, so we have also provided a Microsoft Word document that has the same exact fields that you'll encounter on the online proposal, so you can save that to your computer and work off of that. That's what we recommend because those forms can crash with browsers. It's easier to just have that document and then at the end, closer to the deadline, copy and paste the information from your document to the online form. At the same time, don't wait until the very last minute to submit your proposal. Technology glitches will continue to plague everyone around the world, and so we just like to make sure that we're not scrambling at the last minute to figure out the nuances of an online form with your computer system. Thank you all again for attending. Sarah, I'll turn it over to you in case we have any questions and to also wrap this up.
Thank you, Chase. Yeah. So in the chat, we had some questions about will we receive these slides? And yes, you will. We will have a PDF of these slides that we'll distribute to all the registrants. We also are recording this, so we will send out a link for everyone to stream it, and you can stream it as much as you want at your leisure and refer back. But other than that, I think you were very comprehensive because we didn't get many other questions. So if you have any last minute questions, put them in the chat right now. In the meantime, Chase, I'm going to have you stop sharing your screen. In the meantime, we are also coming up to the 21st International Elephant Conservation and Research Symposium that's going to happen later this year, December 5th through 8th in 2025. It's our first time back in the United States in over 10 years, and we are hosting with the beautiful Fort Worth Zoo, so it should be pretty exciting. And you can present there as well as just attend. You don't have to present, but we would love for you to present. Our call to abstracts is open right now. Abstracts are due July 1st, and we hope to see you in Fort Worth. Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions. Let's see. Chase, couple last minute. What if the project exceeds the budget during activities implementation? Is there any criteria that covers that?
Yeah, I can say a few words, and then Sarah, I think you may also be able to provide some insight. So, as I said earlier, it's not expected that the amount you're requesting for IEF will completely cover all the project activities. We assume you might have to be applying for funding from other agencies. So we ask in our proposal for the total project budget and then the amount you're requesting from IEF. But Sarah, I think what this person is asking is what if you're awarded a grant and you get the funds, but then the activities you described go over cost and what you've budgeted? How should that be handled?
Well, so at least from IEF's point of view, we give a specific amount of money. And like Chase said earlier, we don't allow for a contingency fund. So you will have to reevaluate the funds that we've given you and propose an alternative budget or a change in the agreed upon budget. And we can work with you on that. Hopefully your budget overage isn't catastrophic. These are things that good communication with your funding agencies really are able to get ahead of. So make sure that you're always checking in and letting people know, like, hey, this is going wrong. We need to pivot and do this. Then your organizations will be much more understanding when you do have to make those sort of last minute budget changes and things like that.
Yes, good point. And someone else asked a similar question, but I think you just answered that in your response. Emily asked, do we prioritize the size of elephant populations with funded projects? For example, there's a tiny, almost extinct population of elephants in Vietnam. Is this something that could be funded? Certainly, we like to have as big an impact as possible with the funding we award to our grant recipients. And so we do not necessarily discriminate whether you're looking at a population of only 200 elephants or you're talking about the trans-African population of elephants that is in the hundreds of thousands. We want to make sure whatever funding we award has the impact given. However, it's important if you're working with a fairly limited scope, a limited region, or a limited number of elephants, you justify why that funding is needed for that instance and how that funding is going to have a really big impact. IEF is sort of unique in that our request for proposals is rather specific, and we're a little bit smaller funds at first than a lot of other organizations, but oftentimes that means we can make an especially big impact on these specific locations that might be overlooked by organizations that prefer to support elephant populations with larger numbers. Did you have anything else to add to that, Sarah?
I think you covered it. We don't specifically prioritize any certain population. We really look for what is the best design project and if it makes the impact that it's proposing to. So we would absolutely fund something within Vietnam, uh, with a small population size. And in your proposal, you might want to make the argument that this is a strategically important population. So even though it's small, while why it's important to conserve that, it just depends. So you know your region, you know your um, approach, and make the best argument for it in the meantime. Um, Another question, is it possible for IEF to support livelihoods for communities around elephant ranges? Absolutely. We do that all the time. And that goes back to one of the things Chase was saying is researching the granting organization that you are looking into to see what kind of things they fund. IEF funds livelihoods, funds community action to create sustainable change, anything that will help the elephants and the communities coexist in a better, more peaceful way. And so, if you can make a case for that, if you can tie it into the habitat and the protection, is because it's all related to HEC, human elephant conflict. So, make sure that you make that case, but absolutely, you can have something like that in there. Um, Chase, maybe you can cover this. I got a question in private message. Any standard project impact assessment tool that you might suggest?
Yeah, there are a lot of different organizations that have published guidelines about measuring impact on wildlife. And certainly, if you prefer to use any of those frameworks for justifying the need for your project or how you'll monitor the outcomes of your project, please mention those or describe those or plug into that system as you write your proposal. That's totally fine. At IEF, we found that trying to prescribe to just one of those in a proposal might limit some applicants' ability to justify the important need for their project, so we don't require one specific format or framework for you to follow. As long as you're clearly describing the actions that you're taking, and you're clearly describing how you're going to measure the impact of those actions through those outcomes, that's enough justification for IEF.
Absolutely. Uh, Here's a quick one. If an organization has an active grant, is it eligible to apply for another grant? I can only speak for IEF. You have to look for the specific criteria for all the different granting organizations. But yes, if we're funding you this year, you are welcome to apply for next year. But be mindful, your current project performance will come into play when people evaluate your proposal for next year. Have your reports been on time? Have you been checking in? Are you easy to work with? Do we get quick updates, things like that? So I think you're welcome to send in another proposal, but make sure that you have everything lined up, all your ducks in a row, so to speak, so that you are putting your best face forward.
Yeah. Here's one from David. If an organization uses sports for elephant, is it eligible to get funding? Certainly, if you, as we've mentioned a few times over the course of this workshop, we prefer to fund things that are community driven, that increase the sustainability of elephant conservation in the region. So if one way you plan to do that is by creating a sports program to engage youth in conservation, for example, that's great. You just have to provide clear justification for doing that. And then also on the other side, understand how you're going to measure the impact of that. And that can't just be impact about like the number of children engaged or the number of sporting events you host. It's got to actually be outcomes related to elephant conservation. So certainly, if you've got a creative approach to engage community members or stakeholders, we certainly like to hear about those, and we definitely consider them for funding. And then there's one more question. Is it acceptable to include past project performances when defining our current objectives? Yes, as we've talked about, it's very important to IEF that we understand that our funding is going to actions that have proven track records, whether that's at another project or whether that's your own project. So if you have context to provide about why you're doing something a certain way or why you're choosing a specific outcome to measure, mentioning those in your objective statements or designing your objective statements to reflect your ongoing or previous efforts for conservation helps to paint that picture and to give a reviewer context as they're evaluating your proposal. Jules asks, I would like to know if project will continue to finance the personnel who protect elephants in the bush as they are constantly threatened by poaching. Yes, that is sort of the directive of IEF to help support elephant conservation wherever it's needed.
Absolutely. Um, so we did get a question in private message. I'll read it to you and we'll give the best answer we possibly can. Sometimes project objectives in our area come into conflict with government policies of management. Does IEF have any issues with local government policies? So first of all, IEF is a non-governmental organization. We are not in the position to get crosswise with any government policy, and we're not going to go against government policies. So one thing to stress about all of your project applications is you should always have the legal permission to do the work in the region that you're in. You should always get the relevant authorities, support letters, things like that. It is very important that you're not going rogue, so to speak. We can't oppose those types of things. So you need to make sure that you are working in a legal, sustainable way. And as far as just in general, agreeing or disagreeing with government policies, we can do things behind the scenes to try to shape policies. We can support projects that collect research and data that will hopefully focus and develop policies, but it is not our job to go in there and tell people how to do things and disagree with governments.
Yes, I would also like to add to that is IEF is very specific in our request for proposals about providing documentation that you have permission to work on conservation or with communities or with elephants in your region. So that's things like research permits or wildlife permits or NGO registration in your local government. It's impossible for IEF to keep up with all the changing legislation in your particular country. And so that's why we ask you to provide that documentation yourself. Oftentimes, your work may not require a permit, but we need to see proof that a permit is not required, whether that's the specific legislation that says you do not need a permit or a letter that says you do not need a permit or something like that. We just need to see proof that you have permission to work in the area where you are. As Sarah mentioned, the work we fund has to operate within the scope of whatever legal framework is set up in your country. And so we certainly cannot fund work that goes against that legal framework, but there are opportunities to make advances in elephant conservation if that is the case, as long as we're operating legally.
All right. So we have one more question and then we'll wrap up. Can funding from IEF be matched or combined with funding from other ongoing projects? So yes and no. We are not going to fund things that have already occurred. Anything that you ask us for funding from needs to be in the future. But if the project is ongoing and you want to add us as a funder and propose future work that in conjunction with that project, absolutely. And you are welcome to try to get it matched or combine it with others. We don't expect to be the full funder of every project that we provide grants to. So whatever you can do to get your work off the ground, we are happy to be a part of it.
Great. Sarah or Debbie just put a link to the current RFP in the chat. Now is your last opportunity for questions to be answered live. Um, but I would like to encourage all of you, if you have a project that falls within IEF scope, to apply for our opportunity for funding. Those applications again are due August 1st. And as with any online form, it can be finicky, so please don't wait until the last minute to discover those glitches that technology will throw our way. Any other
Absolutely.
questions on your end, Sarah, before we wrap it up?
I'm not seeing anything, just, we are here as resources, so you are welcome to email Chase or myself if you have any questions that we didn't cover today. Um, and we hope to see great proposals coming forward.
Yes, thank you all. Have a good evening, morning, wherever you are in the world, and we hope to connect with you all soon. Bye.